In the forgotten annals of history, where ink has faded and stone has crumbled to dust, there are stories that refuse to die. They linger in the cold drafts of abandoned corridors and in the mournful sigh of the wind through skeletal trees. This is one such tale, a story etched not in glory but in sorrow, a history written in the currency of tears. We journey back to a kingdom built on a lie, ruled by a king drunk on power, and graced by a queen whose heart was a vessel of silent pain. But at the center of this storm of ambition and betrayal was a child, an innocent princess, whose only legacy would be the sorrow she carried. This is the story of the kingdom of Althenia, and the tragic fate of the girl they called the Princess of Tears, a soul lost to the unforgiving march of history. Before the silence there was a symphony of power. Before the ruins there stood a palace of gleaming marble and gold, its spires piercing the clouds like defiant spears. The kingdom of Althenia was a jewel of its age, a testament to strength and prosperity. But jewels can be shattered, and power is a fragile illusion. Today, its name is a mere whisper, a ghost on the lips of cartographers who no longer draw its borders. The grand halls where kings once decreed the fate of thousands now shelter only shadows and regret. The opulent gardens, once vibrant with the laughter of a young princess, are now choked with thorns and bitter weeds. To understand how a kingdom can vanish so completely, one must look past the monuments and into the hearts of those who ruled. It was a kingdom whose foundations were not laid in stone, but in blood, and whose future was foretold in the endless, silent tears of its most innocent child. King Valerius was not a man born to wear a crown. He was a man who willed it into existence through sheer, unyielding force. He emerged from the lesser nobility, a second son with a firstborn's ambition, his spirit a cold, sharp blade honed by envy and resentment. In his youth, he saw the world not as a home, but as a ladder, and he was determined to climb it, no matter how many rungs he had to break. He carved his path to the throne with a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, mastering the arts of war and whispered conspiracy. His victories on the battlefield were legendary, but his true genius lay in the shadows, in the secret pacts and broken promises that dismantled his rivals from within. When he finally seized the throne of Althenia, the people cheered for their strong, decisive new ruler. They did not see the ghost of his elder brother in his eyes, nor did they hear the echoes of betrayal that clung to his coronation robes. The king had his crown, but it was a heavy thing, forged in a darkness that would one day consume everything he touched. To solidify his reign, King Valerius needed a queen of impeccable lineage. He found her in Seraphina, a princess from a distant, powerful land, whose beauty was said to rival the dawn. Her arrival in Althenia was a spectacle of hope. She was the gentle hand meant to soothe the king's iron fist, the symbol of a new era of peace and culture. Queen Seraphina was more than just beautiful. She possessed a quiet wisdom and a deep well of empathy that immediately endeared her to the common folk. But she was no fool. From the moment she stepped into the cold grandeur of the palace, she could feel the chill that had nothing to do with the stone walls. She saw the fear in the eyes of the courtiers, the avarice in the king's gaze, and the deep, unsettling fractures in his soul. Her marriage was a political cage, gilded and admired, but a cage nonetheless. She was to be the mother of a dynasty, a beautiful ornament for a blood-stained throne, and her heart began its long, slow descent into a quiet, dignified sorrow. A year later the kingdom rejoiced. A daughter was born to the royal couple, Princess Lyra. She was a child of exquisite beauty, with her mother's gentle eyes and a spirit that seemed too fragile for the harsh world she had entered. To the people, she was a symbol of purity, a promise of a brighter future, a living testament that perhaps their ruthless king could find a softer side. But from her earliest days, a strange melancholy clung to the princess. She rarely laughed, and her large, knowing eyes often filled with tears for no apparent reason. The servants would whisper that the child felt the unspoken grief that saturated the palace walls. It was the queen who first called her the Princess of Tears, a name spoken with a mother's aching love and a prophet's dread. Princess Lyra was the kingdom's hope, a single, perfect white flower blooming in the shadow of a gnarled, dying tree. But innocence is a fragile shield, and hers would soon be tested against the cold, unfeeling steel of her father's ambition. As Princess Lyra grew, the palace of Althenia transformed. The cheerful veneer of King Valerius's early reign began to crack, revealing the paranoia festering beneath. The court, once a place of celebration, became a nest of vipers. Every smile concealed a hidden motive, every compliment was a veiled threat. At the center of this web of deceit was Lord Malacher, the king's most trusted advisor, a man whose loyalty was a mask for his own insidious ambition. He fed the king's fears, whispering tales of treachery and sedition, turning him against loyal nobles and even his own queen. The shadows in the palace grew longer, stretching into every corner, tainting every conversation. The queen, sensing this venom, retreated further into herself, finding solace only in the company of her tearful daughter. The king saw enemies everywhere, and the grand halls that once echoed with music now echoed with accusations. The very air grew heavy, thick with the silence of unspoken truths and the coming storm. The crown was not enough. The kingdom was not enough. King Valerius was possessed by a ravenous hunger for more land, more power, more fear. His ambition had become a raging inferno, demanding ever more fuel. He launched a series of brutal, costly wars, draining the kingdom's coffers and its fields of young men. He bled his people dry with crushing taxes, not for their welfare, but to fund the construction of colossal monuments to his own greatness. His every decree was a monument to his ego. He saw his wife, Queen Seraphina, not as a partner but as a silent judgment, her gentle nature a rebuke to his cruelty. He saw his daughter, Princess Lyra, not as a child to be cherished, but as a political asset, a piece to be moved on a board of his own design. The man who had clawed his way to the throne was now determined to make the world his footstool, and he was willing to sacrifice his kingdom and his family to achieve it. Behind her serene facade, Queen Seraphina was living in a state of perpetual torment. She was a prisoner in a palace of secrets, the most damning of which she held locked in her own heart. She alone knew the full, bloody truth of how King Valerius had secured his throne, a truth whispered to her in a moment of drunken cruelty by the king himself. This knowledge was her cross to bear, a poison that seeped into her soul. She watched him become a monster, his ambition twisting him into something unrecognizable, and she was powerless to stop it. Her pleas for mercy for the people were met with scornful silence. Her attempts to shield Princess Lyra from the court's toxicity were futile. The queen's life became a masterpiece of silent suffering. Her tears were shed only in the dead of night, where no one could see the queen of a great kingdom weeping like a lost child. She was the sole witness to the rot at the heart of Althenia, and the weight of that knowledge was slowly, inexorably crushing her. Princess Lyra grew up in a world of beautiful cages and sorrowful lullabies. She knew nothing of statecraft or war, but she understood the language of fear and sadness perfectly. She saw it in the hollow eyes of the servants, in the forced smiles of the ladies-in-waiting, and most of all in the bottomless grief of her mother. The king, her father, was a distant, thunderous presence, a figure to be feared, not loved. He would look at her not with affection, but with a cold, calculating assessment of her value in a future marriage alliance. She was a pawn in a game whose rules she could not comprehend, a delicate bloom in a garden of razors. Her tears, once a strange quirk of her infancy, were now her constant companions. She cried for the mother she couldn't comfort, for the father she couldn't reach, and for the suffocating sadness that clung to the very stones of her home. The Princess of Tears was a mirror, reflecting the true, tragic state of the kingdom's soul. A secret of such magnitude cannot be contained forever. It is like a poison that eventually seeps through the cracks. Lord Malacher, ever the patient predator, chose his moment perfectly. With the kingdom weakened by war and the people groaning under the king's tyranny, he unleashed the forbidden truth. The story of how Valerius had murdered his own brother, the rightful heir, to claim the throne. It was a tale of fratricide, of the ultimate betrayal. At first it was a whisper, a rumor passed in taverns and marketplaces. But Malachar had procured proof, a forged confession from a dead knight, a letter from a bribed servant. The whispers grew into a roar of outrage. The foundation of King Valerius's reign, built on the myth of his strength and legitimacy, crumbled overnight. The man they had hailed as a savior was revealed to be a murderer and a usurper. The loyalty of the nobility fractured, and the simmering resentment of the populace boiled over into open rebellion. The lie had been exposed, and the kingdom was about to pay the price. The fall of Althenia was not a noble battle. It was a savage, chaotic butchering. The rebellion, secretly orchestrated by Lord Malachar, erupted with volcanic fury. Peasants armed with pitchforks and torches joined ranks with traitorous soldiers, their shared hatred for the king uniting them into an unstoppable force. The pristine marble courtyards of the palace ran slick with blood. Priceless tapestries depicting the king's victories were torn from the walls and set ablaze, the flames casting dancing, demonic shadows on the unfolding massacre. The royal guard, caught between their loyalty and their own starving families, broke and fled. King Valerius, the great warrior, found himself trapped, not on a battlefield of honor, but in his own home, besieged by the very people he had scorned. The symphony of power had ended. Now the only music was the clash of steel, the roar of the inferno, and the collective scream of a kingdom devouring itself. In the heart of the chaos, Queen Seraphina made her last stand. She was found not on the throne, but in the princess's chambers, her body a fragile shield before her terrified daughter. The rebels who stormed the room saw not a gentle, suffering woman, but the wife of a tyrant, a symbol of the regime that had starved them. Her pleas were ignored, her dignity mistaken for arrogance. She did not scream or beg for her life. Her end came with a quiet, heartbreaking finality, a swift, brutal end to a life of silent endurance. As she fell to the cold floor, her last breath was a whispered prayer for her child. Her final sight was of Princess Lyra, her face a mask of pure terror, tears streaming down her cheeks as rough hands seized her and dragged her away into the smoke-filled pandemonium. The queen, who had lived in silent agony, finally found her peace. But it was a peace bought with the ultimate price, leaving her beloved daughter utterly alone in a world gone mad. The mighty King Valerius was not killed in the heat of battle. His captors, led by the triumphant Lord Malachar, denied him a warrior's death. They stripped him of his finery, bound him in rusted chains, and paraded him through the smoldering ruins of his own capital. He was forced to look upon the faces of the people he had brutalized, faces filled with a hatred so profound it was almost tangible. The man who had demanded worship was now pelted with filth and stones. His execution was a public spectacle, a final act of humiliation. As he knelt on the blood-soaked scaffold, he looked up and saw Lord Malachar watching from the palace balcony, the very image of a patient vulture claiming its prize. In that moment, King Valerius finally understood the totality of his failure. His ambition had brought him nothing but ruin. He died not with a roar of defiance, but with a wretched, choked gasp, his blood sealing the final, tragic chapter of his reign. And what of the Princess of Tears? What became of the innocent child at the center of the storm? History, in its cruelty, offers no clear answer. Her story splinters into a dozen tragic whispers, each more heartbreaking than the last. Some say she was murdered that same night, her small body cast into an unmarked grave, her tears finally ceasing. Others claim she was sold by Lord Malachar to a foreign slaver, destined for a life of unspeakable misery far from her homeland. A more persistent legend tells of a young girl with eyes full of endless sorrow, escaping into the wild forests, living out her days as a phantom of the woods, a spirit of grief that haunts the ruins of her father's kingdom. No record of her life or her death was ever kept. Princess Lyra simply vanished. She was erased from the world, a final, silent victim of a tragedy she never understood. Her entire existence was reduced to a question mark, a ghost story told to frighten children, her tears absorbed by the indifferent earth. Lord Malachar's reign was short and troubled. The kingdom he had stolen was a corpse, and he was merely a king of ashes and bone. Althenia never recovered. Plagued by famine, infighting, and the ghosts of its past, it slowly disintegrated, its lands carved up by neighboring powers until its name was nothing but a memory. The grand palace of King Valerius was abandoned, believed to be cursed. Weeds grew through the marble floors where the queen had walked, and the wind moaned through the empty chambers where a princess once cried. The story of the ambitious king, the sorrowful queen, and the lost princess became a cautionary tale, a dark legend that faded with each passing generation. The triumphs, the betrayals, the love, the sorrow, all of it was ground down to dust by the relentless mill of time, leaving behind only silence and the cold, unfeeling stones that keep their secrets. Power is a phantom, ambition a poison, and innocence a candle flame in a hurricane. The tragedy of Althenia is not the story of one family, but a timeless lesson written in blood and loss. It teaches us that crowns do not protect the heads that wear them, and palace walls can become tombs. A king's greed can poison a nation, a queen's hidden tears can foretell a flood, and a princess's fragile heart can be the first thing to break when a kingdom falls. The Princess of Tears was lost not just to the chaos of rebellion, but to the cold indifference of history, which remembers the names of tyrants and conquerors, but so often forgets the silent suffering of the innocent. Her legacy is not a monument or a throne, but an echo of sorrow that reminds us of the true cost of power. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.